4-hour hike, we just jump on a webinar real quick. It's a
Oh,
Saturday.
great. So, on behalf of the National Society of Black Physicists and the NSBP Student Council, I'm Alan Pierre-Louis, and with my fellow Student Council member, Carlton Smith, we would just like to thank everyone in the audience and on our panel for coming today, this afternoon. This is Future of Physics 2.0. This is the second of its kind for NSBP. This will be a panel touching on the topics of training and retaining Black individuals within physics. I will be moderating and Carlton will be looking in the Q&A, so feel free to drop questions in the Q&A throughout, but we will be covering those towards the end for Q&A, and we'll focus more on prepared questions for the duration of about an hour. So I'd like to introduce our panelists in no particular order. So we have Dr. Stefan Alexander. He is a professor of physics at Brown University and former president of NSBP. Alexander has had previous appointments at Stanford University, Imperial College, Penn State, Dartmouth College, and Haverford College. He is a specialist in the field of string cosmology, where the physics of superstrings are applied to address long-standing questions in cosmology. In 2001, he co-invented the model of inflation based on higher dimensional hypersurfaces and string theory called D-branes. In such models, the early universe emerged from the destruction of a higher dimensional D-brane, which ignites a period of rapid expansion of space, often referred to as cosmic inflation. He is an awarded fellow of the American Physical Society. He is author of the award-winning books, The Jazz of Physics, The Secret Link Between Music and the Structure of the Universe, and Fear of a Black Universe, An Outsider's Guide to the Future of Physics. So that's a fitting title. Dr. Alexander is also on the board of trustees for the Universal Hip Hop Museum in the Bronx. Next, we have Dr. Gladney. So Dr. Larry Gladney is currently Dean of Science, the Phyllis A. Wallace Dean of Diversity and Faculty Development, and Professor of Physics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, FAS, at Yale University. Dr. Gladney is the former University of Pennsylvania Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Professor for Faculty Excellence in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. While at Penn, Dr. Gladney served as chair of the Faculty Senate, chair of the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and as the Associate Dean for Natural Sciences in the School of Arts and Sciences. For the American Physical Society, APS, he served as chair of the APS Forum on Outreach and Engaging the Public, chair of the APS Nominating Committee that chooses candidates for election to leadership of the APS, and a member of the APS Executive Board. He was also the director and principal investigator of the Penn Science Teacher Institute to deliver master's degree programs for in-service middle school science teachers and high school chemistry teachers. Since 2008, Dr. Gladney has been involved with the Legacy Survey of Space and Time, LSST, mission of the Vera Rubin Observatory. Dr. Gladney has been a member of the LSST Dark Energy Science Collaboration and its Supernova Analysis Working Group since its inauguration at Penn in 2012, planning missions around use of Type 1a supernovae as standard candles for cosmological parameter measurements. He has also held multiple leadership roles in the LSST Corporation, a nonprofit that supports the scientific mission of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory's LSST mission. Dr. Warren Buck is the founding chancellor emeritus and professor of physics emeritus, University of Washington, Bothell, an adjunct professor of physics, University of Washington, Seattle, adjunct professor of physics at William and Mary, former member of the Board of Visitors at William and Mary, creator of the Hampton University Graduate Studies or HUGS at CBAF and JLab, or Jefferson Laboratory, creator of the new High Energy Physics Research Center of Excellence at Hampton University, researcher in field theory and in QCD, APS Fellow and Life Member, artist, yachtsman, and meditator. Okay, so we have Linnell A. Williams. She is a PhD candidate at Harvard University from Memphis, Tennessee. She took an offer at Princeton as a CPBF Fellow, and that stands for Center for the Physics of Biological Functions. She studies the fundamental physics of biological processes. Linnell earned a BS in physics from Wesleyan University, where she was a Ronald E. McNair Scholar. She went on to complete her master's degree at Fisk University, where she won the NSF GRFP. While at Harvard, she received the Harvard University Physics Department's David J. Robbins Prize and founded an education nonprofit, the Women Plus of Color Project. She currently serves on the American Physical Society Council and Board of Executives, representing the Forum on Graduate Student Affairs. She defends for her PhD on May 5th. Last but not least, we have Elon Price. She is a physics PhD candidate at Auburn University, where she conducts research with the Magnetized Dusty Plasma Experiment, MDPX device, analyzing the temporal characteristics of filamentary patterns in highly magnetized low-temperature plasma. She received her Master's of Science in Physics as part of the Fisk-Vanderbilt Master's to PhD program in 2021. Price received Bachelor's in Physics with a minor in Mathematics from North Carolina State University in 2019. In her free time, she tutors Black youth in math, physics, and violin. She co-founded the first NSBP student chapter at NC State University. She also currently serves as the NSBP Student Council representative. So we'd like to thank you all again for coming, and let me know if there's anything else that you would like to add to your intros before we get to questions.
You forgot to add to the thing that I am a humble student of Professors Buck and Gladney from back in the days.
Okay, great. So we have some shout out to old teachers. NSBP is very generational in that way. Okay, great. So to start, we want to know what drew you to physics. This is addressed to everybody. When you entered the field of physics as an undergrad, were there any adjustments you had to make to acclimate to the field or your department? What did you enjoy in your experience? And looking back, is there anything you would improve? Floor is yours. Anybody can start. Free form conversation. Go ahead.
I wasn't supposed to be a scientist. I was supposed to be either a journalist or a politician or a lawyer. I think I had intended to go to law school originally. And so science wasn't a thing for me when I was growing up. I didn't really necessarily see myself as a scientist. It was just something that I did pretty well in terms of like my test scores and things like that in school. But science is like something that I could do as a career was something that I was just completely unaware of. To show you like the level of ignorance I had, I thought engineers were essentially mechanics. So I literally had no clue what, and my grandfather was a mechanic. So that, I just made all of these assumptions. And it wasn't until I was introduced, it wasn't until my high school chancellor during my senior year, actually, he pulled me to the side and said, hey, you've done well in your math courses and you've done well in these science assessments for the state of Tennessee. Why haven't you considered being an engineer? And I looked at him like, why would I want to become a mechanic? After that, I decided to join a summer program at Smith College, and that kind of introduced me to science. And then once I got to college, I wanted to actually be a chemistry major, but decided that I liked physics a lot more. But it was difficult because I didn't take, my high school didn't offer physics or calculus, and that didn't bother me at the time because I never intended to be a scientist. And so it was very difficult for me to get through my courses. So I had to do a lot of extra work. But I think part of the reason why I stayed was because of my interest. So I was stuck between actually biophysics and dark matter. So I was confused as to whether or not I wanted to be an astrophysicist or if I wanted to be a biophysicist. And so through the Ronald E. McNair program, I joined a biophysics lab that was also joint with like AMO research, and just completely fell in love with it. And so that's how I ended up becoming a physicist, actually. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks for that input. Anybody else regarding the prompts? Keep going.
I can go next. I feel like my answer might be kind of like Gen Z. But basically I Googled how do you become an astrophysicist? Because I was already very interested in science. Like I've been interested in science since I was little. And I have like this picture of me holding up a sign that says chief scientist because I did my little potato growth experiment. I was so proud. And so I kind of always had like a background of science. You know, my dad came from a science background. He started out in computer science, and then he went to environmental engineering. So it was always there, but I guess I just didn't really know where I wanted to go with it. Like I just was interested in all different disciplines and subject areas. I didn't know where I wanted to go. And I came to astrophysics because I was always really, really interested in astronomy. But more than anything, I was interested in spectroscopy. When I first learned about energy levels and transitions and electromagnetism, I was just like instantly hooked. I had to know more. And so I started to like go more and more into astrophysics and get into like all of these different like hard science questions and being able to solve things with math. But math was my barrier. So the thing that I had to overcome to really break into the field was to beef up my math skills. You know, I was not that good. I think that it was more like the teaching rather than my innate ability, of course. But eventually I was able to find a learning style that worked for me. And I was able to do this because I was homeschooled. So I had a little bit more freedom to explore my creativity and learning styles and things like that. And so I beefed up my math skills and I was like, all right, Googled, how do I become an astrophysicist? First thing they said is, oh, you need to get a bachelor's in physics. And in my mind, I was like, okay, first of all, I wanted to become an astrophysicist, not a physicist. So why do I have to go through all this? But when I broke into the field, of course, you learn about all different kinds of physics topics when you take your undergraduate coursework. So I started learning about other disciplines that I could go into within physics, and even interdisciplinary things that I could do with the physics knowledge. It kind of like made me venture out and do other research. So eventually that led me to plasma physics because, like I said, my dad was an environmental engineer. So we always had this kind of, you know, care for the environment, eco-friendly kind of principles that we live by. And so I wanted to know, how can I like use my physics knowledge from undergrad to do something that might help us with clean energy and the environment. And so I eventually got to plasma. But going back to undergrad, my experience there, you know, definitely my parents were very aware that, you know, if I was going to go into physics, it's probably going to be just me and a bunch of white males, because it was an extremely white male dominated field, and NC State definitely was a white male dominated school in their phys department. So they didn't want me to be like naive to that fact. And it was very isolating in the beginning, but I think what I had to do to overcome that was to not just like seek out community, but also kind of learn how to navigate those spaces, because I still, at the end of the day, even though I love, you know, my NSBP family, I had to learn how to exist in those spaces. So I would say, yeah, that's my answer to that question.
Thanks for that, Elon. Anybody else? Your start in physics.
I'll give a quick, oh,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Stefan.
I think there are two kind of big things that, well, a couple of things. I even wrote a book about it, but I think one thing was just the realization that, you know, science and especially physics, astrophysics, where you really, that it was kind of like play. It was sort of like, you know, when you realize that trying to figure things out, trying to understand something unknown or play in that field, you're kind of inventing, creating, solving problems, learning new things, challenging yourselves. And I found that, like, you know, when I realized that research, especially not necessarily coursework, but research, the kind of agency you have and the collaborative spirit of that, I found, and the universality, when I realized that actually was something that people all over the world did, not just, you know, people who we think do science, right? When I had that realization. And then the second thing actually had to do with when I finally did major in physics. I was going through some difficult times, being in a pretty much, you know, predominantly white, affluent environment, the school I went to. I just remember, you know, very vividly, just, you know, not being invited to the study sessions, or people, can you add, like things like that. So these kind of things that subconsciously may have been playing on me. I didn't recognize that until one day, and I'm going to embarrass this guy. I went up the street to Philadelphia, to the University of Pennsylvania, and there was a young professor, a brand new young professor, tenured professor, joined us from Stanford, who was a particle physicist. And he was teaching the class that I was struggling in, actually. So I remember I was supposed to wait for him because he was going to interview me for a job. This was the year I was graduating. Maybe I was a sophomore or junior. Anyway, make a long story short, I'm sitting in his office, but I'm waiting for him to come in, and I'm looking at his lecture notes. And I'm seeing, like, you know, he's working out the solutions. I'm looking at his lecture notes. And I said to myself, I had this kind of really like, I can do this one day, because Larry did that. And then when I met Larry, this is the first time I'm meeting this guy, right? First time, and I look up to him, it's like, he's a professor of physics. He's doing this kind of stuff I want to do. There's no way I can be like that. And then Larry sits down, and this is like the year 1999 or something. No, sorry, 1992. And the first thing he says to me is, "You're special." It was the first time in my life that a fellow, you know, that somebody in that position said that, and it really mattered. I joined his group that year, and he used to get together with, it was a group of Black students that year, and one of them is a guy named Kamani, who's now the Associate Dean of Engineering at Brown. That's a whole nother long story. But in a nutshell, I ended up working with a group of us that summer. Nobody knew about research, but the way it was really happening, every now and then he would get together with us and start telling us about the big questions in physics. And he said, "Oh, there's this thing called baryogenesis. It's like really hard to solve, but here's what it is. You know, why is there more matter than antimatter?" Anyway, fast forward, Larry, you're proud to know that the paper now has 262 citations. So that's my little quick tidbit.
Amazing. Anything, Dr. Gladney, you wanted to add to that before we get to Dr. Buck?
Look, Stefan was special. So it wasn't really being, I think, supportive. It was just being truthful. You know, most of what I think we think about our career paths, we don't really realize that there are people who are out there pulling for us. We kind of see the people who we think are blocking us or in the way, that we got to get past them. But there are a lot of people who had clued me in, right, to Stefan, and said, "Hey, you really ought to talk to this guy, right? Find a way to meet up with him." And you know, he comes to me, right? So that was really just the kind of spark that I think a lot of us have had at some point. Once you get old enough, you look back and you realize that these connections that you had no idea how far they were actually going to go, just come at you. And so I would say, like, the one lesson is the thing that Stefan did. One of the things that made him special was he reached out and said, you know, there's something I can take advantage of, and I'm just gonna do it. I mean, so many times I think I talked to students and they had intelligence and drive, but just kind of this fear of putting yourself out there kind of holds them back. And the one thing that you really can't do is to turn down any opportunity you have to move forward in your career.
Appreciate that. And then Dr. Buck, anything on your experience coming into physics before we move on to our second question?
Yeah, I just comment on Stefan and Larry's comments. Larry is very wise, and I think that was a beautiful explanation of some suggestions of what students can do to advance their knowledge. So thanks, Larry. For me, I ran track in college. I couldn't take physics in high school because I think I partied too much, and I didn't do all my studies. I did math and I did foreign language pretty well. But then I got a scholarship off to Lincoln University in Missouri, and went there, and because it was actually a family school. And my mother and father met in the calculus course there, and but I didn't like it at all, so I left because there was a professor who they had, who I had heard about since I was a kid, that he could write with both hands simultaneously, and I never quite believed that. Anyway, when I got to Lincoln, and I decided to transfer to Morgan State, and that professor was at Morgan State in the ordinary differential equations class. I asked him, can you write with two hands simultaneously? And he did. He turned around with the board and wrote. And I think, he was one of my big mentors, all my life. And to be in the class with him was a wonderful experience. Even just that simple thing was amazing to me, let alone the mathematics he taught me, but it was really quite remarkable that he had these talents that were varied. And physics came to me at Morgan. Somehow I took a physics course as I was a math major there, and I did well. Now I have to confess that when I was at Lincoln University and I first went there as a 17-year-old, I did not do well in the physics course. So my grades were 2 Ds. I had Ds for 2 semesters. And when I transferred to Morgan State, I had to take that physics course over again because they didn't accept it. And I think I got an A and a B. I've forgotten now what it was. And I thought, that's because I took it over. It's the second time around. And so I was making excuses for myself in some ways. Then I ran into a professor, Robert Dixon, who spent a lot of time at Morgan State and Morehouse. And he just turned me on, the lights came on, and I just sort of fell in love with physics. I thought, oh my God, this is what I want to do the rest of my life. This is beautiful stuff. You can take mathematics and you can, connect it to the physical world. I was just blown away. And once the light went on, it never went off. And so that's how I got into physics, and had always been interested, of course, in the stars and why they are there and why they sparkle and what the deal is with the stars. And so I did this from a boy, and a little boy, my brother and I would talk a lot about it. But to actually get into a discipline that could discuss that and try to describe those kinds of factors was really, really the powerful thing that brought me into physics. And then once I went to graduate school, that was it. It was just, I was in love, just totally in love.
Okay, thanks for that. Any other input before we move on to question 2? Okay, so I will go to question 2. So during 2018 and 2019, Team Up, the National Task Force to Elevate African American Representation in Undergraduate Physics and Astronomy, examined the reasons for the persistent underrepresentation of African Americans in physics and astronomy in the US as measured by bachelor's degrees in these fields. The task force was chartered by the board of directors of the American Institute of Physics and charged with producing a detailed report and recommendations. The AIP Team Up report defines physics identity as how one sees oneself with respect to physics as a profession. It evolves with one's perception and navigation of experiences within physics. including recognition by others. How students perceive themselves with respect to physics is predictive of career intentions and achievements. By the numbers, though, quote, from 1995 to 2015, the number of physics bachelor's degrees awarded to African Americans increased by 4%, compared with a 36% increase for all physical sciences, which spells very slow progress. So question, what was your experience like growing in the field and identifying as a physicist? How did this differ from your colleagues? Are there any particular takeaways that were more positive, any success stories you had in that regard? But also just want to emphasize what differences that you may have had. So the floor is open.
Well, I can go. So I had always wanted to be a scientist. My story is really just like Elon's. From like the age of 3, I was saying I wanted to be a science. I didn't discover physics until I was 12, but as soon as I knew what physics was, I knew immediately that's what I wanted to do. So I was really set from 7th grade on to be a physicist, and to do that, you have to get an undergraduate degree in physics and then go on to graduate school. So I went off to Northwestern, and I was really set on basically getting a degree in physics. That was like only the first step, of course, but it was an essential one. But going to Northwestern, which was, a very, very white institution, coming from East St. Louis, which was 98% African American, was like stepping on the moon. It was so unusual, so different. A beautiful campus and a lot of opportunity, but you have to start someplace, and you don't really know, because I didn't have any scientists in my family, no role models to look up to. But what I did have was a 100% financial aid package that allowed me to go, because my parents couldn't afford even a single dime for me to go to school. And part of that was work study. And so when I looked at the set of work study jobs, there happened to be exactly one that was in the physics department. And I thought, this is terrific, right? Obviously, this was meant to be. Nobody else is going to want that job out of the 400 or so. And I showed up, and I was the 13th in line, the last one, for this work study position that pays 50 cents an hour. And the interview, when I finally got in to see the engineer, who happened to be the engineer for the high energy physics electronics group at Northwestern, he spent less than a minute. Right, he just went through a set of questions like, can you solder? Can you program a computer? Can you do electronic design? No, none of that stuff. And so he just said, well, I'll call you. And I left with my tail between my legs, really embarrassed that I had not even started my first physics class, and I was already not good enough to get a work study job in a high energy physics group. But I had my Southern sensibilities, right? Since East St. Louis is just Mississippi, moved 300 miles north. And so he said he was going to call. And so I got really perturbed that he didn't call. Like, I knew what, I'll call you is supposed to mean, but it's like, you shouldn't say it if you don't mean it. So I finally got up after 4 days, enough bravery to go back and knock on his door. And I was really, really, really nervous, but I was going to force him to tell me that I wasn't good enough to actually be working in a work study job. And as soon as I poked my head, and he said, oh, it's you. So I guess you're ready to get started. And I said, no, you said you'd call me. And he says, every year I put out an ad for these work study jobs. Every year, a dozen or so students show up. I tell every one of them, I'll call you. I hire the first person who comes back. And I said, well, that's crazy. But I took the job, and I didn't really know why, he would have such a strange hiring decision. But then about 2 days in, I'm sitting there and I'm learning how to solder with these old circuit boards. And the professor, the person who was in charge of the high energy physics group at Northwestern, comes in. And for those you don't know, it's Jerry Rosen. He's like 6'6", really huge booming voice, always smoked a cigar, even though even in those days it was illegal to smoke inside, but nobody was going to tell this guy that he couldn't smoke. He was like the consummate bully. He just comes in and he booms out and he says, "I hear we got fresh meat. Where is he?" And I sort of raise my hand. He says, "Follow me." He takes me down to like the deepest, dankest part of that building, which happens to be a garage, and it's filled from floor to ceiling with 20-foot steel beams and bales of gold-plated copper wire. He says, "I want you to take all of this, and in the next year, I want you to make me 24 planar drift chambers for my new experiment." And then he saw my jaw drop. He slaps me on the back and says, "Some assembly required," and he leaves. And I'm so shocked that I don't realize that I'm lost because I've never been in this building before. I don't even know how to get back to the lab where he took me from. So after 20 minutes, I eventually make my way back. And the guy who hired me sees me and says, "Yeah, I know exactly what happened. Look, what you got to do is you just got to keep at it. And anytime you have a question, you ask, no matter when, how many times a day, whatever it is. If you're confused about something, you don't know how to do something, well, none of us know how to do it, but some of us know more about things than others, no matter what the subject is. So you just ask." And then I realized that, yeah, that's exactly what physics is about. Certainly experimental physics, but probably theoretical as well. You got to keep coming back, right? Only the people who are stupid enough to not give up will actually stay long enough to actually have some success. So it was my first lesson in physics, that persistence matters a whole lot more than brilliance or past knowledge. Because as this guy said to me, I expected all the answers to those questions to be no. You're a freshman, right? Of course, nobody that comes in the door knows how to do any of that stuff. But those are all things that I can teach. So if you want to know why I hire the first person who comes back, that's the one thing I can't teach.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. Anybody else on, your experience growing as a physics and your physics identity? Go ahead, Elon.
I'll pitch in. So I would say, wow, I'm like also so listening in to all the other panelists, and I'm like enjoying this, hearing all this wisdom. But I'd say the biggest thing that contributed to me developing my identity as a physicist, it took a while, because when I got there, it was also very different, not just because it was predominantly white, but also because I was homeschooled, and there was like a lot of and because of the entanglement of me being a Black woman homeschool, it was like a lot of pushback. And apparently I didn't find out till later that when I first entered the physics department, everybody was very skeptical about my success. Because they just like, she's so young and she's homeschooled, and there's just a lot of things stacked up against her. So I kind of felt that vibe anyway, though. They didn't have to say it. I kind of felt that vibe from them, just their expectations of me being very, very low. So what I had to do, to navigate out of this place where every time I felt like if I did something wrong, even if it was a minor math mistake, I was like, I'm not going to be a physicist. I can't go through with this. I had to find my role models and my community. That was the biggest change for me. And that was when I started to develop my identity as a physicist. It was literally when I went to my first NSBP conference. And before that, I had never seen, met, heard of Black physicists ever. Like I don't know if I heard about Neil deGrasse Tyson before that, but he was literally the only guy. Oh, that's right. I did hear about Stefan, but that was also the same year that I went to the conference, Dr. Alexander. We had watched your video of you, the one where you were playing the saxophone and making the connections to jazz and physics, like a YouTube video. We watched that in my modern physics class, and that was probably the second Black physicist I ever seen. So that definitely changed the game. Like,
you're like, if this fool is up there, I can do this. I know I can do this.
Yeah, seeing that, and especially the music part, because at that time, this was my second year playing second violin in the Raleigh Civic Symphony at my college. So just, seeing him and his like the interdisciplinariness of who he was, and then going to the conference and seeing hundreds of people like me in physics and nerdy like me and can't dance like me. It was so great. And it totally like changed the game, and it really made me like develop my identity. And after that, I was like, I'm a physicist. I wasn't even graduated. I was only halfway through. And I was like, I'm a physicist. I'm gonna be a physicist. And I'm happy to be a part of this community and be in this field.
Thank you, Elon. That's very powerful. I can say that I also related to the sax playing. Linnell, did you want to go?
Yeah, I was going to say, like Alon, prior to attending NSBP and randomly emailing a bunch of Black physicists, I thought I was the only Black physicist on Earth. When I was at Wesleyan, it felt very lonely. I'm from Memphis, so it was a huge culture shock. Memphis is a predominantly Black city in the South. And so going to New England and trying to adjust to the culture and adjust to being at one point, I was the only Black person in my department. Was a huge adjustment for me, especially considering that I didn't take physics and calculus when I was in high school. So people assumed that my shortcomings in courses were because I was Black, not necessarily because I lacked preparation in the subjects. And so I experienced a lot of isolation. And I think my experience then and even now has consistently been with people being extremely uncomfortable, either with my Blackness or my womanhood or some combination of the two at the same time. And I'll never forget, actually, my advisor had actually heavily discouraged me from pursuing physics because I was struggling so much in my intro physics course. So he actually told me if I went home, did these physics problems by myself. He said I had to do them by myself. And if I found them difficult doing them by myself, then I should consider, other subjects. He named African-American studies and other things that he felt I would be more well-equipped to do. And if anything, hearing that, if anyone knows me personally, the quickest way to get me to push through something is to tell me I can't do it. And so after that conversation, I decided to continue to stay in physics. And I had a very similar experience in my department that Stefan actually had with people not inviting me to their study sessions, but I'm super stubborn. So they would all study in the physics lounge together and never invite me. They knew that I was there, but they would never invite me. So what I would do is I would sit in the back. No one would ever talk to me. No one would acknowledge my presence. I would just come into the room. I would say hi, and I would sit in the back, and I would listen to their conversations because they weren't willing to have those conversations with me. I didn't realize at the time that you really needed to ask questions and repeat problems and practice them, et cetera. And it got to one point where I was so, and that's not to say that, my stubbornness pushed me through, yes, but there was also a part of me that just felt like, very almost embarrassed for even wanting to be a physics major. So I remember thinking to myself, or I remember coming into the physics department sometimes and looking down the hallway to make sure no one saw me, going to class so that they wouldn't assume that I was even trying, because that's just kind of how I was left feeling, from my colleagues, and continue to have those experiences. Another experience I remember very distinctly was one where I had assumed that, maybe the women would be nicer to me. I'm still a junior, right? There were only 4 girls in the department. Maybe they would be nicer to me and allow me to be a part of their group when we're all taking our E&M course. And I'll never forget this specifically. I was sitting and we were supposed to do a project together, actually a lab together, and everyone had grouped up, including the 3 white, I think my professor asked us to get into groups of 2 or 3. And there were only 4 women in the class out of 40. And I just assumed that these women, at least one of them would pair with me because they say good morning to me every single morning. So I just assumed that someone would be humane enough, because all the guys were terrible to me. So you guys said good morning to me. You would, at least try to keep that balance. And I noticed that the 3 white women, they had paired up together along with everyone else and left me by myself. And so my professor had to ask someone from a different group to come join. And those are just examples of many of the experiences I've had. But even when I was the underdog and people or people assumed that I was the underdog, it still didn't get better when people started to see me as competent either. So fast forward to Harvard, I come in being the underdog essentially to everyone. And I think around my 4th or 5th year, people started to notice that I could do something, that actually had things to say, that actually discovered something, right? And then I suddenly went from being the underdog or someone's, in their eyes, pet, to actually being a threat to them. And then the narrative, changed. It wasn't that I was struggling. It wasn't that, I wasn't capable of doing something. It was, and I'll just repeat this comment that was said to me actually by a colleague. I had presented for group meeting and found some results that were extremely interesting. And instead of them taking that as an example of my competency, one of my colleagues proceeded to tell me that I had to be the modern day Forrest Gump. And if anyone's seen the movie Forrest Gump, that's not a compliment. So instead of them contributing my, hard work to me being a competent person and a competent scientist, they had to create a different narrative that was, oh, it's just luck, right? She came into the lab and did this completely by accident. And so it's been a struggle and continues to be, but I'm happy to connect with anyone else about those experiences. But I think for me, my experience has been people accepting who I am as a person and accepting someone that looks like me and someone that is me can be just as competent, if not more, than they are.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I want to add to that and resonate. I mean, it's amazing that it's so funny that story, how so many of us, if not, I would say, I'm confident to say most, if not all of us, I mean, I think one of the defining features of being a Black person in the United States, in physics and pretty much the sciences in general, has had at some point that those experiences, and they've persisted. I think what's really interesting was when I was a student, when I first met Professor Gates, for example, I think I was 18 years old. I'm 51 now, but that's a long time ago. It was amazing that, like, when I first met him, Professor Shirley Jackson was there, Cynthia McIntyre, Larry was there. I mean, Warren Buck was there, much younger, no gray hair. But there was this intrinsic understanding that even the formation of NSBP was formed precisely because of that universality in our experiences. And that at the end of the day, it's, we are, I just want to resonate and validate what you just said there. And that doesn't really go away. It just changes form. It's like a multi-headed hydra. And as you navigate through your career, it will find those challenges will find that those experiences will shift and change form, but have the same flavor, for lack of a better word. So I want to just say one thing about ways in which I felt were useful for me. So now, like, there's a saying, and I don't believe this. They say, oh, it's lonely at the top. First of all, I ain't at no top anywhere. But one of the things I find that, even as a professor here at an Ivy League school, one of the things that I've done to help me is that I just try to get more Black people in my department. So since I came to Brown, there was zero, and then of course Professor Gates joined me as a colleague for several years. He moved back to Maryland, but now we have 8 Black graduate students in my department. And I don't want to say there's a coincidence that what have you. So for me, the joy of having other folk around and also, something that Professor Gates, when I first met him, told me, and I've always, tried to harness that quality. When I first met him, he said to me, dude, I'm just a regular fella, man. I'm just a guy from the hood. This idea that, like, there's nothing, we're all special, in that sense, we all, I'm not anything different or better or what have you. I'm no super Negro, I am like y'all. And I'm sorry, y'all know, those of you that know me know that I kind of say things, right? But I, in the spirit of being genuine. But just this feeling like, hey, I enjoy being around my folk and talking physics and talking trash, what have you. And because, believe it or not, that is part of the intellectual process. You know, how we harness, you know, when your mind is really at ease and you can be yourself and then all of a sudden start talking physics, you don't know what might be coming out of those conversations and what new discoveries might be made, but we have to actually be ourselves. And I just wanted to just, you know, add that to the conversation.
No, thank you so much for that. Yes, we do want to like keep that authenticity, and we're gonna keep going.
Professor Buck was going to say something.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize for my dog, who I'm with right now, and needs some attention actually very soon. So I may have to leave just for a little bit to come back after I've taken her out for a walk. But having said that, and waiting for my wife to come home, she comes home, then everything's cool. For me, when I became a physicist, when I felt like I became a physicist, when I went to graduate school, I had lived in the Black community all my life, and went to HBCUs and then entered at William and Mary, the only Black face, pretty much. I think there was maybe a dozen around the campus, but I was the only one in physics beside the housekeeping crew, who took care of me very well, actually, which was quite nice to have that. But I ended up, because of I was in plasma physics and built a little experiment, waveguide experiment, which did some measurements with different gases. And that was a lot of fun. But I got caught up in the civil rights and anti-war movements. This was in the 60s. Went to graduate school in 68, so it was 69 and 70. And I got caught up so much that, because it was, you know, the paucity of Black faces around, and when the people I met, the Black students I met, were very unhappy. And I was really in love with physics, and I came to do physics. I didn't really come to break any race barriers. That wasn't my goal. My goal was to learn some physics. And I thought this was a good place. I didn't want to go to a huge place like Shirley Jackson and I know each other from our days back in DC, and we have a mutual friend we still have friends with. I didn't want to go to a big school, and I wanted to go to something that was small, and I was just learning that I actually not only love physics but could do it. So I got caught up in the civil rights thing and began to organize the Black students around the campus. And I was able to do that more so because I was a graduate student the first year than an undergraduate. And my way was all paid by the department through an NSF grant. And but the undergraduate students, you know, their parents paid their tuition and whatnot there, and they were afraid to make any noise because they would get in trouble. Their parents would not be happy with that and take them out because, you know, of safety. When I went to William and Mary, my mother was scared for my life, and especially when I started organizing the students, and I eventually became the founding president of the Black student organization there, even to the point where I was so far away from physics that I met with the president of the university and told him he was a bigot. It was just he and I and his assistant in the room. And I wasn't afraid to tell him. And what happened after that was he contacted the physics department faculty and said, you know, you got to do something with Warren Buck. And they said, no, they're going to support Warren Buck. This is incredible. And I learned a lot more just a few years ago. So what happened there. And eventually we got a charter for Black Student Organization. It's just still going on today. So it's really kind of a nice feeling to be able to help generate a space for Black people to move around more freely and to feel like belonging to the university. And then I got my master's degree, and I almost joined the Black Panthers. I was a half hour away from joining the Black Panthers after I got my master's and left William & Mary because I wanted to go to a Black school. So I was thinking about Howard. And one of my high school friends drove for Huey Newton. He drove when Huey Newton came to town, and he wanted to recruit me. And I almost went in, but I didn't like the guns. I liked the free lunches, and I liked that part. That was a good thing. My mother was one of the founding Head Start teachers in the country, and those were the values that I had. And even though I was a marksman, and I was on the action rifle team when I was at Lincoln. But I wanted to go back to do physics because that was my heart. So I called the department chairman and asked. Sorry, my wife is coming home. So now, just a second, please. Just a second, please.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm back just really fast here to finish off this. I called the department chair and asked him, and I stayed away a year. I was gone a year in DC teaching math at Bowie State College. And I called and I asked him if I could come back. And oh, by the way, when I was out there, when I was in master's, I failed my first qualifying exam. And I got the master's thinking I would never get a PhD at all. But my heart still wanted to do physics. So I called him and he says, I'm so glad you called because we've kept your fellowship open, hoping that you would come back. And I said, oh my God, this has got to be my place to go. So I went back to William & Mary and finished off my PhD. And it was at that point I felt like I was a physicist. I had the feeling that this was really my calling. And I was getting support for it. This was, and this was also part of why I went to William & Mary. There was a proton accelerator, 600 MeV proton accelerator there that was studying space radiation effects, which later has become the Jefferson Lab. And so I followed this all the way through. But the moment I became a physicist, I think, was when I went back in 1971. And I hooked up with a relativist. And I thought, great, this is what I really, really want to do. And so I walked like a physicist. I felt, okay, this is what it feels like. And of course, I ran into racism and ran into all sorts of blocks. In fact, my PhD, Linnell, particularly, she's doing her my defense. Had a committee, and I was giving my defense on a Monday, and on Friday, the Friday before that, and I had only a critical number of committee members on my committee. One of them came up to me and said, all your stuff is wrong. I'm out of it. I want nothing to do with it. That was a Friday before my defense, Monday. And I was pretty pissed off, but also just pretty nervous about how I'm going to get out. I went to another professor and asked him if he could be on my committee, and because what happened, I told him what happened, and he said, Warren, why didn't you tell me earlier? You know, you could ask me earlier. And I said, well, I just need your help now, Hans. He says, well, okay. So he read my dissertation over the weekend, and I did my defense, and and when he came out in the room after they deliberated, he says, congratulations, Dr. Buck. Now I have to go off to my operation. And I went, what operation? Well, he had postponed his own brain surgery so that I could defend my dissertation. Yes. And he's still living. He had the surgery, and he's still living, and he's a good friend even today. But that was a commitment of people I found in my nearby circle. I didn't include the folks who were bigots and whatnot, and there's a whole bunch of them. But folks who genuinely were helping, not so much because I was African American or whatever, but it was they wanted to help. They wanted to give me physics. They understood I loved physics, and they wanted to give me a lot of physics. So anyway, those are the moments I think that concretize me as being a physicist.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Buck. Amazing story. So in the interest of time, we are creeping up on the hour, but we have time for more if the panelists are available. I just wanted to possibly combine some questions, and then if we could get through those and then get to Q&A if everyone has the available time, that would be great. So I'll just kind of highlight some brief parts of what were supposed to be another 3 questions, but basically I wanted to highlight the fact that there are organizations within the continent of Africa, like the African School of Physics, the Edward Boucher Abdus-Salam Institute, that's related to the ICTP, or International Center for Theoretical Physics. And then there's also Simons Foundation's African Mathematics Project. The Caribbean is also a region with many Black physicists that do not get highlighted from time to time. So if anyone could highlight or touch on how we increase participation or highlight performance by Caribbean and African physicists, that would be great. In addition, I wanted to just list out some statistics for HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. So according to the United Negro College Fund and the American Council of Education, 25% of African American graduates with STEM degrees come from HBCUs. HBCUs graduated 46% of Black women who earned degrees in STEM disciplines between 1995 and 2004. 8 HBCUs were among the top 20 institutions to award the most science and engineering bachelor's degrees to Black graduates from 2008 to 2012. HBCUs are the institution of origin among almost 30% of Black graduates of science and engineering doctorate programs. This is amplified in physics as of science.org and AIP, March 2022. HBCUs also claim all the slots on a top 10 list of schools graduating the most Black physicists. The best PWI in this regard was MIT, which graduated 12 undergraduate physics degrees to Black students from 2012 to 2017, and that's including 2017, where MIT had the number of 0. Morehouse, by comparison, had 8 in that same year. So HBCUs are obviously doing a lot of the heavy lifting. How can PWIs do a better job in accommodating Black physicists? And then also just quoting the Team Up report again for the purposes of touching on economics. Team Up research identified financial challenges as one of the greatest difficulties facing African American students. So has anybody had hardship in that regard? And how can departments hold on to students knowing that financial hardships are some of the strongest factors that lead people to leave school or leave the major of physics. So all in all, how can we participate and increase our participation and highlight our relationship to Black physicists abroad? How should PWIs address the fact that they lag behind HBCUs? And how do we address some of the economic or financial crises that students might face? It's very large, but in the interest of time, you can touch on any of these
I
things.
kind of want to go first with this one because it's very relevant. I was most recently the president of NSBP, meaning that I just completed my term. Of course, President Oleshi, and then of course President-elect Stephen Robeson, who was on the board of the administration when I was president. And it's funny that those questions are really, really important questions. In fact, when I look back, these were actually some of the top priorities actually we were going after. All right, amongst those three questions. I want to comment on that and comment on the evolution of that, because there is strategy involved in this. So the first thing was, I teach at a PWI, right? And my school, I think Farah will be the second Black PhD to graduate from Brown. I got my PhD in 2000 from Brown. But I guess my point there was, it's really about bridging cultures and ecosystems. So what do I mean by that? One of the things NSBP did very strategically, right, was, we actually partnered, we formed relationships. And what do I mean by relationships? I'm talking about working relationships, not just talking. With PWIs like the Simons Foundation, right? They have, they spend $600 million a year or something like that, right? And they're the primary funder of private funder of physics research in the country, one of the primary funders. And so and that was interesting, because what happened there with the Simon Scholars Program, it was mandated, right? That the students, the 20 to 30 students that come every year to spend 8 weeks in New York City. In fact, we're looking at Carlton was a NSBP scholar. But the point there, this was a research experience, but we made sure that it was mandated that at least 50% of those students had to come from HBCUs. So what happened was the Simons Foundation, like an organization like that, started to see the quality, right, and the brilliance and the hard work of these students. That's why there was no mistake that the president of the Simons Foundation wrote a $7 million check for Spelman last year, for example, and wrote a $65 million check to replicate the Meyerhoff program that Freeman Habrowski did on UBMC in New York City. It's because NSBP, we forged these working relationships in ecosystems that are not used to having us and having people from students and faculty from HBCUs. So NSBP served in a sense as a catalyst and a bridge, right? To sort of bridging and connecting our members to these other PWI environments. And I think it's been so far very, it can be more successful, but I think I just wanted to add that that's something that has been a big priority of NSBP. So to answer your question, the answer is NSBP.
Thanks for that. Can we have two other people just address maybe helping Black physicists internationally, and then also the financial hardships that students go through? I think Dr. Alexander covered HBCU versus PWI outreach very well.
I have a comment, and very quickly, is my advice is to become the boss.
Oh.
Just become the boss. Now, there's a whole lot of issues in that, of course. It's not as simple as just those words. And sometimes you'll have to put away some of the research that you're trying to do to make it happen. But once you make it happen, you're at the table, you are the table, and you can help call the shots in a different way. So one of the things I did at Hampton was to create a research center, by a lot of luck and fortune. And we were putting out, at the time, the number of African Americans getting a PhD in the country, the average was a half a year. We started putting out 3, 4, and 5 per year. Is blowing the top off of that statistic. I think more to this question. I'm going to go back to this question that Alan just asked. Funding. The point I made about becoming the boss is a long, long story, which I won't take up a whole lot of time, but it's really important to think that way. But getting financial support is really, very important. And I think there's some challenges these days now, more so than it has been when I was in school, and Larry and Stefan, there was a lot more money available, particularly for African Americans. But the success has not been very great. And I think that comes from, some of the wisdom that Dean Gladney put forward earlier was, ask the questions. Go to people. When somebody says, I don't know, or it can't be done, you thank them and you walk away and you find someone else and ask the question. You be persistent at it. And that is, one of the biggest act that you can make is to continue to ask the questions and don't listen to people who say it can't be done, because they obviously haven't done it. That doesn't mean that we can't do it. Okay.
Great, thanks. And then Elon.
Yes, I just wanted to speak to your point about connecting across the diaspora, because I think that's very important, especially because, like me, myself, my family comes from the Caribbean by way of Jamaica, Barbados, and Cuba as well. So I think that it's important to highlight that connection, because we are a national, American society. But we also have an identity, the part of our identity a lot of times comes from an international place. So I can just add by saying that my experience so far is limited, but I really want to dive into that. And by making those initial efforts and connections, I have come across the African School of Physics and the Caribbean Science Foundation. So just for people who are not aware of those things, the African School of Physics is a program that every 2 years they host a summer school. And this is usually intended for African students from different countries that are in physics on the graduate level. But I talked to the director of the program, who works at Brookhaven, I believe, and I'm forgetting his name, but gosh, if I knew it. What did you say? Yes. So I met him, and he offered up to open up the opportunity to me as an African American student. So this was going to be during COVID, unfortunately, that I was going to go to Morocco and do the summer school and get a crash course on a bunch of different things in physics. And they host the summer school at a different country every 2 years. So that's something that's really dope. And when I went to visit Brookhaven, there was a bunch of students from the school, and they were so excited to see other Black physicists as well, because I'm not sure how the numbers are, but I'm thinking they're low there as well, because the aim of that program was also to increase the representation. And we also have students that come to our student council meetings. We had a student call in from Nigeria at one of the member meetings, and it was 3 a.m. there. I was like, bro, you need to go to sleep. But, he wanted to be a part, be with the fam. And that was really dope. I get emails from students in different African countries all the time that I really need to respond to, just introducing themselves and wanting to know what's up with National Society of Black Physicists. What is that? They want to be a part of this community. So like Dr. Alexander was saying, I think that NSBP is really the vehicle and the bridge to make these kinds of connections that we can connect across internationally, across different countries. And the other thing I'll mention, so I'll drop these links just in case you're super curious. The other thing is the Caribbean Science Foundation. I specifically attended the SPICE, which is a summer program, and they had to develop a technology, and it was more than just the physics of it. It was also, and the science of it, it was also like communication skills and business, because they had to like promote this device that they made. For example, they made something that was called Spot Crime. That's how they called it. That was the name of the device. And it was glasses that used Raman spectroscopy to somehow be able to recognize crime that was happening, because that was a serious problem on the island that they came from. I think that was either Jamaica or Barbados. So that is another program that exists. And within that program, anybody interested, you can become a virtual mentor / counselor, I guess. And most of the mentors and counselors were PhD students. So there's opportunity to connect there and to be a part of that experience. So I'll definitely drop the links for those in the chat.
Thanks so much, Elon. Thanks for that. That was very comprehensive. So I'm going to give ourselves our last question here to the panel. It's very important. And then we'll have a brief Q&A that Carlton has probably compiled. But if there's any other questions, please start sending them in. So our last question will be, less than 25% of physics PhD degrees go to women, according to the American Physical Society. Between 1973 to 2012, 66 Black women were granted PhDs in physics, and over 22,000 white males were granted physics PhDs. Black women have noted that in trying to obtain physics degrees, they face challenges such as exclusion from study groups, which we covered, and the unique problems that come from the nexus of being both a Black person and a woman in the field. Are there any particular methods this panel has found that have helped Black women pursuing their PhD and also preserve their mental health?
I'm going to take that one. And it kind of relates to what PWIs can do and some of the comments that were made. I want to co-sign this sort of transactional relationship. I think for me as a Black woman, I don't see what does it benefit an institution that was essentially made. I go to Harvard, so I can only speak for my experience going through the PWIs I've gone through. What does it benefit wealthy white people that people like me actually survive and get through these spaces? Like, what does it benefit them if I'm taking up spaces that are meant for them, right? And so I think for me, the way that I sort of deal with that sort of reality, and I deal with the sort of combination of being Black and female in these spaces, is ensuring that I'm not like, I don't expect white folks to not act up. Like at the end of the day, like I'm not going to sit up here and like pretend as if like people aren't going to respond to me in the ways that we historically know they have responded to us. That does not mean that we can't necessarily navigate these environments in a way that keeps us whole. And I think for me, I think that it's been helpful to keep my relationships with people transactional and more compartmentalizing my sort of well-being and my emotions and things in a way that preserves my Blackness and my womanhood at the same time. What do I really mean by that? I think that when we say that we want, I guess, a seat at the table, like sometimes there isn't space, and some people aren't necessarily ready to go outside of their means to make space or even get up, right? Especially white allies. I think they're some of the most dangerous people I've encountered in my experience. And not to say some of them aren't useful. I believe that some of us who sort of seek out, I guess, I'm seeking equality, right? I'm seeking to be an equal. I'm seeking to be seen as a whole person. Some of us are seeking to be owned, honestly. Some of us are seeking to be pets, and some of us are seeking to sort of take the little nuggets that they throw our way in these spaces to just say we exist, right? I think that, you know, when you're a Black person, you're fighting a lot. You're fighting the system, you're fighting like these people, you're even fighting people who are yourself, right, in these spaces. You're fighting white supremacy, right? And people who are acting through, acting in response to white supremacy and sexism and all these other things that we talk about in our society. And so the way I sort of preserve myself is allowing people to show themselves, number one. Number two, I don't allow people to adopt me, right? I think I keep it very much transactional. I don't seek that sort of, you know, belonging in a space that was never really meant for us to really belong. I need them to create space for me to exist the way that I want to exist, right? And I need them to give me the space that I deserve, right? That's a loaded question, so I'm going to stop there. But hopefully some of that made some sense. But I think that it's just, let's stop seeking like approval. There you go. That's the word. Approval and acceptance from people who are never taught to accept us. That is my issue. So for me, I go in, I do my work. I say, hey, if I make a friend, I do. If I don't, I go back home. I just, you know, at the end of the day, I see my Black friends when I need to. I see my other friends when I need to. I do what I got to do at the end of the day. You know, I try to help out, or, you know, thank you for inviting me to the panel. Like, I show up whenever I need to. But at the end of the day, I'm not expecting these people to not, and I don't mean to say it in this way, but, you know, there was a saying that like some people in my family would say, act their color, right? I don't expect people to not act their color. Like, at the end of the day, like, I'm Black, I'm female, I'm in this space. If you want to be a good white person, great for you, right? But like, I'm not expecting that from you off the bat. That's it.
No, thank you for that. That's very powerful, and I think everyone in the audience can learn from it, or if not, just resonate with what you said. So,
Linnell, one day I hope you become president of my university.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
That was right on.
That was right on. Yeah. You should apply to be. Come out to the Pacific Northwest. You have to make decisions, Linnell.
great. So, I think Carlton had one question in the chat, and if we just have that one, then I might add just a brief question to tee everything off. But I think Carlton, go ahead.
Yes. So the question is, I'm the new vice chair of the APS Forum on Diversity and Inclusion. What can I do to promote racial matters? I found that this group doesn't want to talk about race, but goes all in on LGBTQ and physical disabilities issues.
I like to take that one. Let's talk. I just became the vice chair of the Forum on Physics and Society. Let's just get together and talk. I don't know how we need to get emails exchanged here somewhere, Alan, but
right. I see that's the question, so I can ask for those and exchange them at the end. But for sure, go ahead, Dr. Brooke.
Yeah, I think I just want to encourage that the questionnaire to chat with me, because I'm trying to figure out what to do too. So it'd be great to get together and talk about how to help APS and leverage it to help African Americans in physics. So there's been also the NSBP, the APS has been trying to get NSBP to join APS, which I think is a good thing not to, but it was, there was a lot of debate about this some years ago. And but this may be some ways, in an indirect way, that we can do it. And also Larry and Stefan, if you have people who you want to recommend to get fellowship in APS, the fellowship closes on June 1st. So let's get people like that in there, so we can make our faces known.
Okay, we have another question in the chat, Carlton.
Oh, can I respond very quickly to the last question?
Sure.
I think when it comes to issues of race in relation to other characteristics that, or groups that people may fall under, intersectionality is a thing. So Linnell and Elon can talk about their experiences being Black women in physics. And if you only have a conversation about women physicists, you should make sure you're talking about all women in physics and like actively question who falls under your banner, or if you're like truly living up to the banner you're discussing. If a conversation about LGBTQ physicists, make sure that you cover all LGBTQ physicists, regardless of what race or color or gender they are. It essentially makes sure your sample size is representative of the sample size of like the actual population, because there are people who have intersectional identities with all of these groups.
Right, and I think that's something that is in the works in certain areas between people who are in the field. So to highlight, so okay, we have another question in the chat. So if you'd like to read that, Carlton.
So Justin Crawford asks, I'm interested in being a cosmologist / string theorist. What are the steps I should take to achieve this? Currently, I'm a senior physics major.
Send me an email and we can get on a Zoom call and talk all about it. I'll be probably, the best is when I'm hanging at the beach somewhere and I have lots of hours to just sit back and tell you about the recent paper I wrote. Actually, I got some sweet revenge, right? So anyway, that's a long story, but I found, I wrote a paper with some Indian physicists recently where we found an example of a solution of a state in heterotic string theory, SO32, that corresponds to a positive cosmological constant. So if you want to know more about that, jump on in, send me an email, and we'll get on the call.
Great,
Yeah.
And I think we have one more question, but Alan, you said there was another question you wanted to ask.
Yeah, so the anonymous attendee, I will highlight theirs. My question was just, what is everybody excited for in physics generally? But this anonymous attendee wanted to touch a little bit more on the rift between Black Americans, African, and Caribbeans within physics, and they sense that there's a cultural disconnect that isn't being acknowledged or addressed. So we can go with either one of those, and those will be our last questions.
I hate to suck the air up in there. I know Elon has Caribbean roots, and this is very intimate with me. I was born in Trinidad, and I immigrated. My family immigrated to the Bronx when I was 8 years old, and I have very strong feelings about this issue, and those strong feelings are really reflected. I mean, anyone that knows me extremely well, I know some students that know me. I don't see, there's a statement. I was in Jamaica once. I was at the University of West Indies, and I was hanging out with this Rasta guy. I call him the Rasta physicist. He was actually an galactic astrophysicist from Jamaica and the island of Dominica. He was a Rasta guy though. And he only liked to do his equations on the sand with a stick. He was an interesting guy. Anyway, we were talking one time. I was a grad student at that time. He said to me, yeah, man, we just drop off on a boat somewhere. So in other words, by definition, I'm African-American. This idea, our ancestors, our people were just dropped off in a boat somewhere. You go to New Orleans, you go anywhere in the country, you can really see all the connectivity. Don't get me wrong, there are political and cultural realities that we must acknowledge. But, I very much strongly self-identify as being an African-American, regardless of what island or what part of the United States I come from. And, yeah, so that's my direct answer to that. And if there is a rift, I'm the first person to correct somebody on those false perceptions of, you know, whatever, thinking that, you know, or looking down on others and that kind of stuff. At a deeper level, it's much more empowering to just realize that, sounds corny, but that very real diasporic connection, that we're not alone. We're not isolated. You know, I highly recommend each and every one of us to find, as Larry talked about, opportunities to just go overseas, spend 2 weeks at the University of the West Indies, go to the University of Ghana, go hang out and understand that you're part of this, you are African American in the bigger context, you see? Anyway, that's just my take.
Right. Okay. And then anybody, go ahead. Anybody?
Yeah, so I'm African American in the sense that my family comes from the folks who basically like were enslaved in the United States specifically. And so it's funny that Stefan brought this point up about identifying as African American. I didn't know there was anything else other than Black until I got to college. To me, we were all just Black until I got to college. And then when I got to college, and not to discount anyone's cultural background, because I think that's extremely important to point out and to acknowledge and to cherish. But we have a lot. I didn't realize that there was a rift until I actually got to college and these conversations came about. And in a way, when people were super ignorant about it, I started to empathize with them, because when you think about it, it's all kind of a part of this like larger issue with white supremacy and trying to separate us, and teaching folks about African Americans in a way. Many of my Caribbean and African friends have told me just very plainly that their families would tell them about staying away from people like me, et cetera. And I'm sure that there are messages we received as African Americans about people who are from the Caribbean and people who are African as well. And I think we're just sort of playing in this larger game of white supremacy and keeping ourselves separate and not helping each other. And that's not to discount, issues. So for instance, there is the issue, especially like places like Harvard, when we talk about Black, a lot of that category doesn't include people specifically who are the descendants of people who were enslaved in this country, especially from places like the southeastern part of the United States, people who are from Memphis, people are from St. Louis, people who are from Birmingham, et cetera. That is a genuine issue, but we can have all of these conversations at the same time without trying to, set this divide, but, across the diaspora, and not have these conversations and try to uplift each other.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Devin Walker was one of my students.
Yeah, Devin's a genius.
Elon, you don't have to raise your hand.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we didn't want to move on. I just wanted to plug that we have an International Affairs Committee on the Student Council, and we are looking for ways to bridge the gap and connect us more across internationally, all over the world. So one of the ways is that we'd like to possibly collab with different organizations like Caribbean Science Foundation. So once again, if you're looking to get more experience specifically within STEM, you can check out that link I sent, and there's opportunities for mentorship and for serving as a counselor, things like that. But also at the conference itself, there have been tons of international students that attend. And we'll probably continue attending in the future. But as far as the student council, we are thinking about definitely having networking events and other fun opportunities for us to come together as NSBP members, and those members that are also from different parts of the diaspora. So I think that this is crucial. I think it's very, very important. And of course, it's personal to me, because as I said, I have definitely a mixed background. I say more West Indian because it seems like my family kind of just did an island tour to all the different islands. But I also have, African roots as well, from my mother's maternal side being from Virginia and enslaved in the past. So they come from of course, of Africa, way back originally. So I personally think, how I was raised, that it's very important that we connect. But I think for science and for physics specifically, there can be benefit, because there are, for example, there are moves to build facilities and light sources and things like that in the continent, in different countries. And those can be great opportunities for us in our careers. So stay tuned because we got some cool things cooking up.
For sure. So that was the last question. I don't know if we want to go all the way to the prescribed time of 5:30, and that would probably take up a little bit of the audience's time. But on behalf of the Student Council for NSBP, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. The panel was lovely. The questions were great. And I hope that this time next year we'll be able to do something similar. Hopefully it was an edifying experience. Thanks to Carlton for helping me moderate, and thank you to all the panelists again for taking time out of your busy schedules to teach us a little bit about your experiences. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
And the old people say something before
Well,
sign off? Maybe I want to invite Larry to say something as well. I just want to say that I'm just completely moved, and I can't describe how proud I am and honored just to see what Student Council of NSBP is doing, the leadership, the professionalism, the excellence. And also, we just know that y'all are going to be, the next shining light. You're going to carry the torch. You're going to take it to the next level. We're going to see some Nobel Prizes. You know what I'm saying? And that, to me, is why we do this. And this is so beautiful. Thank you all so much, Student Council. And as Brother Willie Rock said, be blessed.
All right. Thanks so much. The feeling is mutual between the students, the Student Council, and all of our mentors. So with that, I'd like to close this session of Phuture of Physics 2.0, and everyone have a great weekend.
thank you. You too.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for the attendees as well.
Stefan, I'm
Thank you.
so proud of you, man. You're doing fantastic stuff.
Well, you made it,
Absolutely.
y'all helped made it happen. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for y'all. I'd be very real about that. I'll never forget it.
Yeah, the students, I agree with Stefan. You're all just fantastic. You're the light and the stars.
Just invite us to Stockholm, okay? Please, when you get that Nobel, just don't forget. When you make that big bucks,
Then you got to after that. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank